Good morning to our viewers in the US and good afternoon to our participants in Germany and Europe and beyond. Welcome to our online event, Lessons Learned, how to reinvigorate and further strengthen the transatlantic partnership. Before I'm going to introduce our distinguished moderator and our two outstanding panelists, I would like to especially welcome His Excellency Philippe Etienne, Ambassador of France to the United States, His Excellency Kurt Jäger, Ambassador of Liechtenstein to the United States, and as ambassadors, Victoria Nuland, Charles Rees, and Peter Allgeier, as well as Nicole Menzenbach, Consul General of Germany to New England, former members of Congress, Jim Colby and Charlie Dent, long time no see. We're happy to have you with us today, among many other distinguished representatives from the diplomatic community, US government, companies, think tanks, and universities. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Linartz. I'm director of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Office for the United States, based in Washington, DC. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or in English, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, a German institution with civic education centers all around Germany and more than 100 offices worldwide, is hosting events about transatlantic relations, our close cooperation between Germany, Europe, and the US and Canada all around the year, and not only on this side and that side of the Atlantic, but also in other parts of the world. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we had to cancel most our regular events and visiting programs, both here in the US as well as in Europe. But thanks to YouTube and Zoom, we would, of course, like to stay in touch with you. Virtual meetings are, of course, no substitute to personal encounters, as we all know. Nevertheless, I'm sure that we can look forward to an excellent discussion today, because on our virtual podium today, we are happy to welcome three outstanding experts on transatlantic relations, whom I would like to briefly introduce before I hand over the microphone to Peter Rashish, who is our today's moderator. Let's start with Peter Bayer. Peter is a German lawyer, a member of the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, and since 2009, member of the German Bundestag, the German federal parliament. Since April 2018, Peter has been serving as the coordinator of transatlantic cooperation at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. As a parliamentarian, your constituency, Peter, is the district Mettmann II, which is for our US-American audience located in the very west of Germany, and I may say in the very center of my home state, the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Peter studied law both in Germany, in Düsseldorf and Bonn, and in the US at the University of Virginia School of Law in Charlottesville. You became one of Germany's first officially certified intellectual property specialists, working both for German as well as for law firms headquartered in the US. A committed Atlanticist for many years, Peter Bayer stands out among members of the German Bundestag and his party as one of the most committed advocates of a strong transatlantic relationship with the United States and Canada. He serves as Parliamentary Special Rapporteur on Transatlantic Relations in the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He is an active member of the Atlantic Brücke, the Aspen Institute, and United Europe, in addition to numerous organizations in your constituency, in your district. Peter is also Executive Vice President of the Southeast Europe Association. Thank you so much for being with us today, Peter.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Our second panelist today is Robert Zoellick. Bob Zoellick is Senior Counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical and Advisory Service of Brunswick Group, and a Senior Fellow at the Belfast Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. In addition, Bob serves on the boards of Temasek, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, and Twitter. He chairs the International Advisory Council of Standard Chartered Bank and is on the advisory board of Swiss Re. Bob was the president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, US Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, and Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. From 1985 to 1993, Bob served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury and Undersecretary of State, as well as the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Bob studied law and public policy at 3 universities, like Peter, Harvard Law School, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and at Swarthmore College. And you are a recipient of various highest honor awards of the US government, as well as the governments of Germany, Mexico, and Chile. Your latest book, and this is the promotion part, I have to do that, Bob, which has just been published a few weeks ago, is titled America in the World, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. I'm sure you will touch upon some of your findings later on during the discussion, because it's of course worthwhile when it comes also to talk about trade, to have a look at the past in order to find out about future solutions and challenges. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. Last but not least, Peter Rashish. Peter will be our today's moderator. He's a senior fellow at and the director of the Geoeconomics program at AICGS, the American Institute of Contemporary German Studies. And of course, we all know Peter from the wider Atlantic bloc. Peter has served as Vice President for Europe and Eurasia at the US Chamber of Commerce. Previously, you were a senior advisor for Europe at McLarty Associates, and you've held positions as Executive Vice President of the European Institute on the Paris-based staff of the International Energy Agency, and as a consultant to the World Bank, to the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Atlantic Council, the Bertelsmann Foundation, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Peter has studied at Harvard College and at Oxford University in the UK, and your articles and commentaries have been published in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Interest and Foreign Policy, and he has appeared on CBS, NPR, CNN, and CNBC, among others. Peter, thank you also so much for your support, not only today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's good to be with you and with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and with our two distinguished guests today. Just a couple of housekeeping points. We will start off with a fireside chat with Peter Beyer and Bob Zoellick, and then we will open up the floor to your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and that will help us to do so. So let me start off by recalling to everyone, if we need to, that earlier this month, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of German reunification. This accomplishment, I think it's fair to say, is an example of strong US and also broader transatlantic statecraft that you, Bob Zoellick, had an important hand in at the time. To start off, I'd like to ask both of you, what do you think is the main lesson from a successfully reunited Germany that the next US president should keep front and center? Is it that US alliances are crucial for managing disruptive moments in history? Who'd like to go first?
Bob, you would have to turn on your mic.
I just said, Peter, since it was German unification, I think a German should go first.
Okay, yeah. Actually, it's an honor to sit together with you, Bob, on a panel. We did this in Berlin and in DC before, so I'm really thankful and really truly honored, because you're one of the architects of German reunification back then. We were the chief negotiator for the US side for the 2+4 agreement, so that it was at all possible to celebrate 30 years of German reunification. Thank you for everything you've done towards that. So to your question, Peter, lessons learned, reunification, future role of the USA. I think it was a good start, or is a good starting point to focus for a moment on our common history, because that helps to understand why we are still important today and will certainly be in the future with different realities. I mean, we are celebrating 30th anniversary of Germany reunification. We had 70 years of the Berlin airlift and many other things where the United States played a major role. And sitting here in Munich, in Bavaria today, earlier today, I had a meeting with the liaison officers from the military who, you know, have the connection to the local and to the state authorities everywhere where U.S. soldiers are stationed. The U.S. soldiers have, over the past decades, had a very important footprint, a big U.S. footprint. This is eroding a little bit, but we all, I think, have to accept that times are changing. Transatlantic relations are also changing. And, you know, we have to cope with the current changed transatlantic reality. So I think we should have learned by now, both sides, by the way, not only the United States of America, but also Germany, and I would also add the European Union as it stands, that allegedly good old times are bygone times. They will not return in the way we now looking in retrospect, we think were pink. So I think everybody should take off his or her red road spectacles, and we don't have the luxury to waste any more time and to find ourselves comfortably nestled in transatlantic nostalgia. So if I think what should be the lessons learned of the transatlantic agenda is understand each other better. I mean, we had a difficult time over the past almost 4 years under the current administration, but we should not shy away from facing the responsibilities that we have. The whole portfolio of transatlantic issues are on the table and will remain there. They're not only Donald Trump made, most of them have been there before. Trade, WTO, and all this stuff had been there before. Bob Zoellick knows much more about that than me. But I think a good first step in accepting the changed realities is identifying common interests, accepting that the realities have changed. But please, if I may say that, I have a big wish, and the request is better communication, as allies should do. That is one of the lessons learned that I would start with, and would that put as top priority on the transatlantic list. Better communication, not unilateral stuff that we've seen in the past that goes to both Brussels, Berlin, and Washington, D.C., because we should also learn that we will need each other with all China coming up on the horizon, China realities. That is important. We should understand, we have to understand, only can we secure peace, stability, and the relative prosperity that we all enjoy is when we understand the transatlantic relation is key for that also in the future. It takes political leadership for that.
Bob?
So let me start by giving a special thanks to Peter and for his work on the transatlantic agenda. It must not have been so easy over the past couple of years with the U.S.-German relationship, but those of us in the U.S. really appreciate your commitment to it, as well as that of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be with you. Let me just suggest that there's some insights I think one can draw from the approach taken to German unification. The diplomacy of 1989 and 90 operated at two levels. One was a sense of history and strategy, and I think that's always important to keep in mind. But two, connected with a fingertip feel, that wonderful German word, Fingerspitzengefühl, for events on the ground. As for the history, many retrospectives focus on the Russia question during that time period. Our first priority was the German question. So since 1871, the German question was, how do you deal with a powerful state in the heart of Central Europe without secure borders? And there were two world wars on that issue. And after 1945, the solution was to have two German states with the West German democracy integrated within Europe and the alliance. So in 1989, the United States was committed to supporting a unified democratic Germany within NATO and within an integrated European Union. We believe this would reassure neighbors, both East and West, and we thought it would be positive for Germany and the future of Europe. There's another point, though. Throughout the Cold War, you could see Washington often faced the question of whether it would put its priority on alliance relations or dealing with the challenges in Moscow. And Bush and Baker in that time period definitely put the alliance relations first, because they believed it was not only a commitment, but also was the right strategy in dealing with the challenges of Gorbachev in Moscow. There was another historical point. We wanted to avoid what we called a Versailles victory. By that, we meant a settlement that plants the seeds of its own destruction. So for Germany, it was critical that we avoid discrimination. The term we used was singularization, because we didn't want to plant the seeds of some frustration from a future generation of Germans, which might have seemed odd at the time, but if you think about the politics of parts of Europe, something we had to be careful about. For the Soviet Union, it was to try to offer reassurance on security and economic benefits and borders and political standing. But the second point was just as important, which was the facts on the ground. And here, it's important to recognize the real momentum was created by the German people, East and West. And that was something we used diplomatically, because if there was a stall, it would have created a crisis. And to the contrary, we could use the impetus of events on the ground to push those countries that were reluctant, Soviet Union, Britain, France for a while. And so the point was, how do you connect a strategic and historic perspective with events on the ground? We used the 2+4 process to do that, and we had to deal with other issues, the conventional force arrangement, changes in NATO, CSCE, some of the economic issues. And it all, amazingly, if you think about time today, occurred within about 11 months, 10 to 11 months, and just in time, because in August of 90, you had the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, and my bosses were pulled off on that. By December, you had Shevardnadze resign. By next August, you had the coup in the Soviet Union. But the point related to today is not only the insight of trying to think historically, strategically, but with a feel for events on the ground. But we had expectations that Germany, by reason of its size, its economic power, was going to play a decisive role in Europe's future. So while we were following through on a commitment of the past, we were also trying to look ahead. And we had hoped that by having earned a special relationship through the decades of the Cold War, and particularly in the closing chapter, it would help to leave a stronger foundation for a US relationship with Germany as the heart of Europe and NATO. So I think it's very foolish to ignore the consequences or drift or even rupture in the relationship, because the strategy and the reasoning that led us to focus on the German question throughout the Cold War and in 1989 and 90 has not gone away.
Thanks. Let's turn to China, which Peter, you mentioned briefly in your response to the first question. I remember that not far from the Belfer Center at Harvard, where Bob, you are a senior fellow, there's a plinth with a quotation from John Kennedy's speech at American University, where he pledged the United States to help make the world safe for diversity. And of course, Kennedy had in mind the US-Soviet rivalry at the time, but the rise of China has created a new kind of diversity, the contrast between Beijing's state capitalism and the transatlantic approach more based on the market economy. So my question is for the two of you is, do you think the United States and Europe can learn to live with China as it is, or does a thriving multilateral trading system require China either to change its economic behavior or more dramatically for the US and the Europe to decouple their economies from China?
Should I start?
Please.
Okay, good. Thanks. whether it's the question of all questions, how to deal with China, how should we position ourselves? Do we actually have to make a decision actively, or is the world coming to us? Which I would not agree. But we have to accept China as a fact. The rise of China politically, economically, everybody wants to do business there, making experiences there. But from the political side, of course, we have to address everything that is going on in Nanjing with the Uyghurs, in Hong Kong with the so-called security laws, and many other things, environmental protection, intellectual property protection. So we have to first see that China is a factor, is a reality, and that we cannot ignore. And I completely agree with Bob in answering the first question when he said it would be even foolish to ignore the rise of Asia and how important that is getting important. It's a factor on the planet now. That is a different thing than back then, like 30 years ago, during the time of the German reunification. So somehow what I would say is, again, we need political leadership, meaning we over here in Europe feel somehow now, oh my God, we are stuck somewhere. We're squeezed in the friends in the West, which is the United States of America, and they're in the Far East, the Chinese. They're actually not so far away. They have the 17+1 format. They have the so-called euphemistically called New Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes right into the heart of Germany and Italy and other places here. So you cannot really accuse those political leaders and business people who are actually making agreements with the Chinese. But on the other hand, it shows that we are insecure of where do we stand. We have, as I said earlier, I think in my remarks to the first question, I'm concerned about an erosion of the transatlantic bonds, not only having to do with the withdrawal of troops, but many other things. Also has to do with, if you look to the polls that are out there, tons of them saying that Russia's Vladimir Putin and Chinese Xi Jinping are considered more friendly, more sympathetic, more important by Germans, by a really majority of Germans, as opposed to the leaders or the leader of the United States of America. That really is something that is a reality. When our constituents feel like that, consider that, we then, I think, need to make active decisions. And now there's always the question about decoupling, yes or no. I think the question is not so much about, and if we talk about decoupling, it's most of the times we talk about technological decoupling, 5G, critical infrastructure and telecoms and all that stuff, data sovereignty, which is a big issue currently. I think nobody should be afraid that the Europeans are decoupling themselves from the United States of America when it comes to decoupling of for example, data protection and digital sovereignty. That is a great field, a fantastic field of future transatlantic cooperation in the field of 5G and beyond. AI is something like that. But we also see that, I would put it the way, we also already have a de facto value decoupling from China. And we don't share with these guys the same values, or they rather don't accept universal human rights, some of the points I mentioned before. But on the other hand, also I think it would be extremely foolish to decouple ourselves from huge market business opportunities there. But if we really want to, so I think it would be foolish to make decisions in regard that yes, we don't want to have to do anything at all with the Chinese. I think we are already beyond that point to make a decision we want to decouple completely. But together with the American friends, I think we should sit down and identify and cooperate much closer together on where are our shared interests based on the shared values. That is respect for the individual, respect for intellectual property, respect for the environment, respect for human rights, freedom of speech, all that stuff. That is a no-brainer to me. If we are in the situation to make an active decision as societies, as political leaders, that would be very easy for me to say it's the Americans. But then you look retrospect the past 4 years, there had been, an erosion of multilateralism, Paris Climate Accord, World Health Organization, many other things. So, I mean, we can sit and complain, but I think it's overdue to sit together at the table and talk about this stuff, because neither the Europeans nor the United States of America will be able to survive alone.
So, Peter, I think the U.S.-China relationship is in free fall, and we're not sure where the floor is, and I think it's quite dangerous. And as Peter suggested, I think that over time, how the United States and Europe come together on this will probably be the decisive factor. The United States needs to work with its allies across the Pacific, but I think on the larger scheme of things, how Europe and the United States deal with this will be fundamental. Now, of course, there's been changes in China. So one of the anecdotes I relate that try to explain this kind of builds off your first question, Peter Rashish, which was when Xi Jinping became the president of China in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union. And he directed all the party cadres to see the film. Now, if that film had been developed in Germany or by the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Gorbachev would have been the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version of the film is a little different. Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned a communist party, broke up his country, led to ruin, and the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. So there's no doubt that under Xi's regime, there's been a focus on strengthening the Communist Party, sort of centralized control, state sector as well. However, where I think the debate, at least in the United States, has gotten off track, is there's a new conventional wisdom that all cooperation with China failed. And that's just flat wrong historically. I wrote a piece in the National Interest earlier this year where I tried to outline some of this, but to give a little flavor, in the Korean War, China was a direct enemy. It then tried to sponsor revolution around the world. It had surrogates in North Korea and North Vietnam. And it moved from being the world's leading proliferator of nuclear weapons and missiles to actually accepting international norms and being quite cooperative. I don't know how you deal with North Korea and Iran without having some cooperation with China. From 2000 to 2018, when I went back and checked at UN Security Council resolutions, China aligned with the United States on 182 of 190 of those resolutions. Sometimes the US had to compromise and water something down. In 2005 and 6, when I was dealing with Darfur and genocide in Sudan, I got actually some considerable help from China. And on the economic side, people overlook that China's global current account was about 10%, came down to zero. That's all added global domestic demand. It stopped manipulating exchange rate. For 15 years, it was the fastest growing export destination for the United States until Trump's policies. It's quite cooperative in the global financial crisis. I worked very well with it at the World Bank. It supported sort of the IMF. Even in the area of the WTO, where there were numerical obligations, China has met those obligations, which were, by the way, deeper than those of other developing countries. The problem is in the harder to measure areas, such as Peter works with in IPR. And frankly, over time, China's taking steps on climate and the environment in part for its own self-interest. Now, my point is not that all is well. My point is that diplomacy's work never ends. But if we start with the assumption that cooperation with China didn't produce anything, we're likely going to end up in very bad policies. So the way that I would approach this is first, we have to get our act together at home. That's not only in terms of our economy and our society, but to emphasize an open society. So I've been troubled that the Trump administration sort of follows the pattern of China by closing off for students or visas, or closing off consulates, or making it harder for Chinese to come to American universities. And even worse, there's threats to Chinese Americans. we're throwing away our trump card. In the larger struggle, our openness is our greatest sort of asset here, while you obviously have to take account of security issues. Then you need to work with your allies, exactly what sort of Peter mentioned. You need to have a multi-dimensional strategy on security. You're going to have a deterrence as Chinese power expands. That's going to require, frankly, I think, a different force structure than we have with some of our current sort of naval assets. But also, can you prod China on points of mutual interest? And I found that you could. It doesn't mean that everything is great, but I'd be interested in Peter's views. If you take intellectual property rights, as China's moved up the technology chain, it's more attentive to protecting intellectual property. They created these intellectual property rights courts in a number of Chinese cities. And by my count, about 85 to 90% of those cases are won now by foreigners, but the penalties aren't high enough. So I'd focus on higher penalties. Forced technology transfer, that's prohibited by the Working Party report when China joined the WTO. But it was always hard to get evidence from companies to bring the cases. So frankly, I'd focus on ending a lot of the joint venture requirements, which create the temptation. Belt and Road, we're not going to stop it. The question is, can we push for follow-up on some of the things that President Xi has now pledged about transparency and procurement and environmental issues? Let's create an alliance to focus on those topics. For state-owned enterprises, Europe has a lot of experience with state aid provisions. You either build those disciplines in or you offer some counter. And my point here is that, the Trump approach, which is to basically, raise protectionist barriers, do a managed trade deal that hasn't produced anything, frankly, or it's about half of what it's supposed to have produced. What results does that get you? And even on the question of values, which Peter eloquently talked about, this doesn't mean you working with China means you cede your value position. Frankly, on Hong Kong, rather than sanctioning the leadership, I would open the doors for people from Hong Kong to come to the United States as Britain did. That shows the difference between the two different societies. And frankly, it's probably good for us over time as well. So this, as Peter mentioned, I think the issue for business people to focus on is that I think the critical issue here is personal data and security. And what we've seen in the United States is there's sort of a trend where any personal data becomes a national security issue. If that is the posture, you're really going to cut off work in life sciences and so on and others. You're going to see the decoupling, I think, in some of the telecommunications information space. But I personally would like to see the United States and Europe try to come together on what are the fundamental data protections we should offer our citizens, regardless of whether it's the Chinese government or any other government. And what are the rules for privacy? What are the rules for platforms? What are the rules for transferability of the data? And it's interesting, the European Union through the GDPR, frankly, was setting the standard for this. That is now actually probably behind the times. Europe is now having a bigger debate. And I think we'll see. I think the United States is now going to have a more active debate on this. And so this really goes back to Peter's critical point. At a minimum, as our societies are trying to come to grips with those fundamental issues of privacy and citizens in a digital society, they should be comparing experiences. And we may not have it 100% agreement, but probably it'll give us a lot more sort of common ground approaching this issue with China.
May I just very briefly come back to the 5G, Huawei, ZTE, Chinese telecommunication. The Chinese, there's a lot of nice talks and, we are the bad guys, and you look to their own laws, what they had to do. But apart from all that, Chinese representatives are massively threatening German government currently and German representatives, massively threatening for really with massive consequences, not specifying them if we would decide against Chinese technology in the 5G network, be it de facto or bluntly, naming them, which I think would be stupid. But I just wanted to mention that is a reality. And in Germany, we have not yet made the political decision. It's been postponed. It's been lingering on for over a year now. But I think we will see in the next couple of several weeks this year that will be passed by the cabinet, by the government, and then turn over to the parliament, and we will see new dynamics there. But the threat is really massive by the Chinese.
Thanks. If we could look at the World Trade Organization for a moment, I think it's fair to say that the WTO has not achieved that much progress in agreeing new trade rules since its founding. It's especially noteworthy in the area that the two of you were just discussing, the digital economy, which sort of really didn't exist 25 years ago when it was founded. But we've also been talking about China and its economy, and I think it may be also fair to say that the existing WTO rules don't really accommodate China's rise very well. And then we've seen the problems with the dispute settlement, largely because the Trump administration has blocked the appointment of new judges to the WTO's appellate body. Can the WTO be fixed? And if not, or at least if not right away, what's the best way for the US and the EU to work together to write new rules to bring the trading system up to date?
That is definitely something for Bob. He's so much more qualified than me to answer that question. I have some remarks later, but I want to listen first to Bob.
Okay, I'll start off on that one, Peter. Well, for the near term, we have to take modest steps to show its usefulness. In international bodies, success breeds success, just like in domestic politics. And so I think if I were offering guidance, I'd focus on some topics like availability of medical supplies, so sort of stop the export bans, similar with food exports, try to work closely with the international financial institutions and the banks dealing with trade finance, which was a problem in the global financial crisis, has apparently been less of a problem now, but you have to keep a watch for it. Work with other institutions as supply chains change to create opportunities for infrastructure, and maybe look for an advantage on something like eliminating nuisance tariffs, which all tariffs under 3% or something to create some progress here. For the medium term, there'll have to be bigger fixes. One is the need to open up possibilities for what trade people call plurilaterals, or sort of liberalizing coalitions. You want to keep the basic most favored nation principle for your sort of basic obligations. But if you have 164 economies that anyone can sort of hold it up, you're going to have, if people won't use that form, they'll move to other types of form if you want to create new arrangements, for example, in the digital area. I think something I've talked about with Pascal Lamy, in terms of getting the dispute settlement system back, it's always hard to kind of look at dispute settlement without the underlying rules-making part of the system. And in 2001, I tried to use something called safeguards to avoid, this is with steel, to avoid the abuse of anti-dumping countervailing duties. And the idea of safeguards is it's a temporary relief mechanism, but it's supposed to be transparent and it's supposed to end at some point. But it's a way of having a political safety valve for some of these sort of older, sort of politically sensitive industries. The way that those provisions had been interpreted by the WTO didn't give you as much room. So is there a possibility you could come up with something that deals with the political need while also restarting the appellate system? We've talked about the need to have rules for state-owned enterprises and state capitalism. There have been discussions on that. The European Union and others have had. Frankly, I think Ambassador Lighthizer, Bob Lighthizer, has not really wanted to preserve the WTO system. He wants to go back to the old GATT sort of panels. So I don't think they've been serious with this administration. This question of special and differential treatment, obviously there's some poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa that you want to sort of give additional flexibility, but it's very hard to support the politics of trade when you've got sort of big middle income countries that say, oh, well, we need sort of special advantages, particularly because a lot of the tariffs and barriers in the US and Europe are already sort of relatively low. I think the environmental issue is going to be very important. And frankly, if you have a Democratic administration in the US, I think how you connect environment to trade will be significant. The European Union has talked about carbon border taxes. That's a discussion I think you would hear with a Biden administration. So are there ways that can be dealt with? And then also issues like exchange rates, where there are provisions within both the GATT and the IMF that are supposed to prevent manipulation. They've never really been operationalized. People like Fred Bergston at the Peterson Institute came up with some interesting ideas about how you could create some standards for that, and if need be, intervene to push back. These are longer term aspects, but it gives you a sense that the multilateral system always has to adapt. The changes are always there. And one other one that would certainly be necessary to deal with quite quickly, which comes from the finance ministries, but obviously has trade implications, is the digital tax system. And obviously, there's arguments that you can understand for the position Europe has taken, but one does need to recognize there's a certain irony here, since Americans are always charged with unilateralism, often accurately. The taxation system has been based for well over a century on the idea that you tax where people produce as opposed to the consumers. And so I personally can see the need for change, but for Europeans to change it and say, oh, well, now all the rest of you have to adapt, looks kind of unilateral to me.
Yeah, I do not have to add very much to that. I just can say that I'm out of more or less a state of emergency, because the current WTO is completely dysfunctional for multiple of reasons. The Europeans, several other countries have agreed. I think it was in April, and was entered into force end of July this year. They have created something like a parallel or substitute arbitration mediation body, but with a clear statement that should not be there forever. We want to work towards a reformed, again, fully functional WTO. And it's really sad that the U.S. administration is accusing Europeans being to get that this substitute mechanism has been initiated or prompted and very heavily supported by the Chinese. So why are we always building up these Grand Canyons between, we are close allies between the United States and the Europeans? We should be. I think we have a lot of very similar ideas, but it just struck me when you just mentioned that you think that Bob Lighthizer, the current USDR, rather wants to go back to the GATT system. Hopefully not, but we should all be prepared to really be open and frank, to start really seriously with an attitude also for compromise, and really with seriousness towards a reform of the WTO structures and the mechanisms that really mirror the current situation of globalization of the current system as it is. But we also, speaking of reciprocity, going a little bit back to the last question, but also plays into this current question. Reciprocity is something that should be there from the Chinese side. As we all know, China is abusing the multilateral system, the mechanism, the structure of WTO. So I have, to a good extent, a lot of understanding for the United States criticism here. But I don't want to pick up. I don't think it's a smart approach to build up these Grand Canyons across the Atlantic. On the contrary, we should identify here where our interests are, and that we need a fully functional WTO systems. The countries need that, the companies, the businesses need that. Otherwise, we would be harmed.
Thank you. Let's recall again, that in 1990, the year of reunification, the Soviet Union was still standing. And today, Russia is no longer a superpower, but it remains an important factor in European and transatlantic security. Peter Bayer is the coordinator for transatlantic relations at the German Foreign Ministry. You know well that there have been German-American tensions over Russia lately. Do you think the next US administration should be able to align European and American policies better vis-a-vis Russia? Or do you think that the tensions, for example, over the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline are a sign that there are always going to be diverging approaches to Russia between the US and the EU because they simply have different economic and security interests?
First of all, I would say, it really is astonishing how this stupid pipeline project ever made it up to one of the top 3 priorities in transatlantic relations. And then one of the top priorities in transatlantic tensions. It's a mistake had been made also in my country on this side of the Atlantic. It has never been popular. I'm not an energy expert, but I try to dig a little bit deeper into that topic, and I have my doubts if we need it or not. It's almost been built, so I don't want to talk too much about Nord Stream 2. I just want to express my really a little bit angriness that we actually have to deal that that allow to climb up to occupy transatlantic dialogue, which it should not. And now even the Navalny case is used or abused in connection with Nord Stream 2 and sanctions, all that stuff. Why? I mean, we should urgently come back to a constructive, positive transatlantic agenda. And there I am on Russia. We are definitely, it's easy to see if you look at a map, it's easy that we're so much geographically closer to Russia. But, one has to wonder what has Russia to offer as a state. And when I say Russia, I do not mean the people, which they have a lot of history, tradition, fantastic culture and everything. But, we look at Russia, at the Kremlin, at Vladimir Putin, and what has his system that he created, wants to probably reestablish. What does he have to offer? There's missiles, there's oil and gas, and so where's the attractiveness of that system? But having said that, we are over here in Germany. We are certainly under the threat of the Russian missiles. It's a future battlefield. It sounds like Cold War, but it's reality. Vladimir Putin has invested tremendously in the military sector, much more than we here in Germany, definitely. And so, but I don't want to have the confrontation so much. Russia is a country, is a huge country, obviously, and Russia should be back on the international stage. It's needed. Syria, Iran, many other things. Russia, China, for that matter. The Arctic, it's a field. The Arctic Circle. The Arctic is a field of common interest for many reasons. But it's up to Vladimir Putin to make the decision to walk the bridge, to come back to the stage. So we see, there's one of the German intelligence services this year said, we are back to the Cold War time with regard to agent and espionage activities. Think about that. That is not a good signal. And about what happened in Berlin. There was a public killing in the so-called small Tiergarten of a spy, and so all these things make it really difficult. It's good that the German chancellor, she's fluent in Russian. Vladimir Putin speaks fluently German. That is something, the chancellor has tried so many times to reach out, to build that bridge, that Vladimir Putin comes back to the international stage. But having said all that, it's just a description. So I would say certainly yes, we should not allow Nord Stream 2 or other fields of tension across the Atlantic to say we are giving up on a cooperation towards Russia. We have a lot of interest there. And look, for example, both our nations are members, obviously, of NATO, for example. That is important. We had this year, which has to be interrupted, this huge so-called Defender 2020 NATO, US-led NATO exercise, and it will go on next year with Defender 2021. And of course, it sends a message towards Russia. The Russians are doing the same on their side. So there's a lot of confrontation, but a lot of cooperation already in the security sector between the Americans and the Germans and the rest of the NATO nations. I would see much more aligned politics and policies between our two countries, the USA and Germany and Europe than in the past. And again, I mean, it's sad that we talk about Nord Stream 2. I'm not interested in Nord Stream 2. Let's turn to a really positive, constructive agenda. There's so much more responsibility and so much more we can do in sciences, in artificial intelligence, cooperation there, also in energy.
Bob, would you like to offer any comments?
Well, I'd just say to help Europeans understand the perspective in the US these days, you might have heard we have this election going on. And election manipulation will be the big issue determining the next administration's policy towards Russia. And frankly, I think the Obama administration was too lax on this. And of course, Trump hasn't done anything because I think trying to manipulate democracy's election systems really goes to a fundamental security issue. Second thought, I think one has to accept the reality that Putin's worldview plus his own sort of, in his view, his efforts to reach out to the West and his lack of success in that has given him a perspective that he's kind of returning to the notion of Russia as the Eurasian state with and its traditional role between sort of Europe and the East. And he's not fundamentally going to change his position. He's going to be sort of a geopolitical manipulator. It is interesting to watch on his borders with Belarus, with Kyrgyzstan, and with Armenia and Azerbaijan. His long-term position doesn't look to me as such a strong one, in part for the points that Peter mentioned. At the end, you have to watch the economy and the demographics and other parts of Russia. Therefore, I believe we should always keep our channels open. But on the other hand, if they try to interfere in our election process, as it appears they are, I think we should make them pay a price for that, frankly. But I think what Peter is going to is, I think, the bigger point. Again, if we have a change here, if Biden's elected, he's going to have a huge domestic agenda. He's going to have pandemic and trade healthcare system. He's got inclusive economic recovery. He's got climate and environment. He's got immigration. He's got racial issues. And there's only so much a president could do at once. But I think if you leverage those topics, they actually could create a foundation for sort of rebuilding transatlantic and other alliance ties. We're focusing on, for example, biological security, which is going to be an ongoing problem. This isn't just sort of one pandemic. Trying to understand, again, the climate and environmental security issues. We've talked about the data and security, which is a combination of security, but also opportunities in terms of the technology. In immigration, if we make some changes, frankly, I hope it'll lead to some change policies with Mexico. So I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs Online where I said you could actually leverage these topics to, in a sense, sort of have a good agenda with your European allies, your Asian allies. And from that, you then deal with the two big challenges that we've also identified today: the future of free societies, which matters to both of us, and China. So you could imagine how you could leverage a domestic agenda. And what I'm suggesting in that is, I'm not saying, and I know Peter isn't, you give up on the traditional concerns, the problems of nuclear proliferation, nuclear conflict, warfare, people taking over other countries. Those are going to be realities we have to deal with. Maybe Europe has a sense of those a little sharper now that it wasn't so sure it can rely on the US. But those are not going away as issues. On the other hand, you can't ignore what I'll call the sort of the new security agenda. And frankly, I think you can do both in a way that actually strengthens our political ties.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter and Bob. Since we're getting towards the end, let me now hand it back over to Paul Linhartz for some closing remarks.
Your mic is still off, still on mute.
Yep. Okay, I should be on now. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Indeed, I know that our panelists both have a very tight schedule, so I have to unfortunately end our today's online event. I'm sure, though, that we could have continued for some more time. I would have had a few more questions. I know that one question, we could at least indirectly answer one of the questions from our audience. Before we leave the meeting, though, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Peter Bayer, to Bob Zerlich, and of course to Peter Rashish for your time, your invaluable contribution, for your interesting remarks. I learned a lot, and it was really worthwhile to have you on our virtual podium. I would love to shake hands with you guys right now to express my gratitude. This is not possible, unfortunately, next time. I would also like to express my gratitude to our participants, both in the US and in Europe, for your attention. I hope we could fulfill your expectations. We will host our next Transatlantic online event on October 28th. Please join us. For now, goodbye and stay safe.